I am going to go ahead and introduce Hans now. Hans received his BS and MS degrees in agricultural meteorology from Purdue University. He currently works for Purdue Extension, serving in Posey County as the Ag and Natural Resources Educator. During his tenure, he assisted in development of the Dynamics of Climate teaching curriculum and a series of Purdue Extension publications on basic climate science. He currently co-chairs the North Central Climate Collaborative, a 12-state team of extension professionals with climate expertise. Hans, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you, Brooke. It's great to be here with you, and I'll go ahead and say, additionally, I am part of a family farm, 6th generation, so we are definitely not regenerative agricultural practitioners, but you take everything one step at a time. So with the majority of my background then being in the weather and climate realm, what I want to share with you today is this discussion on regenerative agriculture and climate change, but I probably should have flipped the order of the two, because the first thing we're going to get into today is the climate aspect, and then we'll talk about regenerative agriculture afterwards. So here's kind of the outline. There's going to be a focus when we talk about climate on central Indiana, Marion County in particular. So I'm sorry for the New York folks and Minnesota folks that you won't get extremely localized data for your particular locations, but some of this certainly comes your way as well. I'm going to look briefly at the summer outlook because the Climate Prediction Center releases those, and then we're going to get into what Marion County and central Indiana can expect for the 2040 to 2070 climatological average period. Then talk about regenerative agriculture and the interconnectedness of regenerative ag, native plants, and adapting to a changing climate. So the first thing I have to discuss every climate talk I give is the difference between weather and climate. Weather is the day-to-day variations in the Earth's atmosphere. Could be a thunderstorm, could be a clear sunny week, or the lifespan of a high pressure system. Whereas climate, by definition, is the accumulation of these weather events over at least a 30-year period. So the World Meteorological Organization has a definition of climate, and their definition states that you are taking these individual weather variables at a location and you're averaging them over at least 30 years. So could be mean annual precipitation in a location, or it could be a change for more than 30 years. In this case, month of July, high temperatures for 40 years. So if climate then is the 30-year average, then the climate change is the difference between a 30-year average and a different set of 30 years for the same meteorological variable. It could be a whole new 30 years, or you can have overlap. And I give the exemplar here of 1971 to 2000 and 1981 to 2010. We're currently operating under the climate normals, what the National Weather Service calls climate normals, of 1981 to 2010. Back in, before we had the 2001 to 2010 numbers, we operated under the 1971 to 2000 numbers. And when those new 1981 to 2010 numbers were computed, they actually waited an extra year before they released them to the public, because including the aughts, that 2001 to 2010 set of variables, changed the climate normals so much that those 81 to 2010 numbers were referred to as the new normals. Now, the 1991 to 2020 normals are going to be released, they say, mid to late May of this year. So very soon we're going to see what effect the weather in the 20-teens is going to have on our climatological normals. So the definition of climate change with these different 30-year sets is pretty common, right? you take different sets of 30 years and you're always going to have some amount of change. Historical climate trends. Indiana breaks down into 2 different climate classifications according to the Köppen-Geiger climate classes. And you see here that southern Indiana is in a CFB climate, whereas northern Indiana is in the DFB climate. And the difference between the two is warm and temperate southern Indiana versus snow in northern Indiana. And central Indiana exists kind of as a transition zone. A hard line in the climate classifications is listed there, but the hard line doesn't really get experienced quite as much by those of you living in central Indiana. So it is blurred just a little bit. If we look at some of the observations, we can see from previous observations, minimum temperatures in the summertime, the June through August averages here. We are seeing in central Indiana those increasing. And we've got only a 0.3 degree Fahrenheit per decade average, but the trend line is definitely pointed up. And as we start to get minimum temperatures that average above 65 or 66, you really start to experience some plant stresses that you wouldn't experience otherwise. I live down here in southern Indiana, far southern Indiana, and we're starting to see some of those things that go along with nighttime, summertime temperatures that consistently stay above 70 degrees for a week or two, and it's not great. So maximum temperatures in the summertime, meanwhile, are shifting negative just a little bit. And this is reliably due to the fact that if your minimum temperatures generally in the summer are going to cool to the dew point, and your dew point is increasing, the water in the atmosphere is going to have a negative effect on maximum summertime temperatures. So it's so humid that we're actually seeing the ability of those temperatures to spike up, delayed a little bit. Precipitation is definitely something a little bit more pronounced, talking 0.98 of an inch per decade increase. And an inch per decade doesn't seem like it would be all that much. It does mess a little bit with like college classes in climatology, because you're like forced to learn on tests what the Indiana average precipitation is. And if it's changing, then I still remember what it was back when I was in college, but it's much more than that now. The problem with increasing precipitation, even if it is only an inch per decade, is that intense precipitation is also increasing, which means that extra inch is falling on a flood day. So central Indiana, number of days has increased by about 2 from 1950 to 2010, as far as days in which you would expect precipitation that, regardless of soil type, according to Gene Tockley at Iowa State, would saturate a soil that inch and a quarter. If we look at annual total precipitation for the entire state, follows a similar slight trend line, with once you get into about 1960, if you map a different trend line, that trend line increases at a more rapid rate. This is another way of looking at extreme precipitation events. In this case, they're looking at the events that exceeded 1900 to 2016's 99th percentile. So the 1% chance of getting a precipitation event so extreme, and you see the trend line is increasing, and you've got some days in the 90s and aughts and teens where you're up at 8 events per year. Growing degree days are increasing just a touch in central Indiana, but those growing degree days are falling on the edges of the season. So the first fall frost in the autumn, central Indiana is in the October 11 to 20 time frame on the old map from the 80s. And as we look at the newer map here, you've got a little bit of a bullseye going on down there in Monroe County, looks like. But you're falling then maybe just a touch a day or two later in that October 17 to 21 kind of time frame. Last spring frost, you see the shift just a little bit as well. We've got on the old map here about a May 1 to 5 for the northern part of central Indiana, and April 26 to 30 for the southern part of central Indiana. And as you shift over, you see basically we don't have anywhere in the state anymore anything after May 1. So a little bit of a shift there. The growing season, as we look at some future predictions, that lines up well. So historically, we would see April 24 to October 15, and we're heading towards the 2040 to 70 average being April 8 to November 1 for central Indiana. And as you take a look at the maps, we're already creeping towards that event today. Okay, I talk about plant hardiness zones because it's a climatological thing and it can change. I don't like plant hardiness zones, and I'll tell you why. If you look at, well, you can see the change there, but I really want to focus on the 2012 newest map. And once the new normals, the new climate normals come out, then the plant hardiness zone map can be changed and updated. So expect next year new plant hardiness zone maps to be released, if not at the end of this year. But if we look at Indiana, we've got two general zones. We've got zone 5 and zone 6. And zone 5, with this 30-year period of 1976 to 2005, basically what you do to determine the plant hardiness zone is you mine the data for the coldest night you can find in winter when you get the lowest temperature you can find, and you basically mark that as your plant hardiness zone. So -20 to -10 degrees was observed in that 1976 to 2005 period as the coldest they could find, and so it gets a zone 5, -10 to 0 for zone 6. And I think if you're looking at a climatological variable, even if you're looking over the course of 30 years, you're taking a meteorological variable to define your zone. So I'm not a huge fan of plant hardiness zones. We can look at climate change as well in regards to what's happening to our rainfall or the composition of our rainfall. So the Clean Air Act was passed in 1990 that really started setting up scrubbing of sulfur emissions from coal-fired plants. And the thing worked. I've got a 14-year-old, did not learn in elementary school, and I asked him every year what acid rain was. And as it turns out, doesn't need to know. The pH of our rainfall in 1985 was in the 4s, and the pH of our rainfall in 2017 here, I need to get the most recent map, was up into the 5s. So pH being a logarithmic scale, our rain is 10 times less acidic today than it was before the passing of the Clean Air Act. And since it was passed in 1990 and today is 2021, that's over a 30-year period, so that can start being a climatological variable. Well, of course, we scrub the sulfur out of the air so we don't have the acid rain. We also don't deposit it back down onto the ground. So as a result of this climatological change, we also see that growers are showing sulfur deficiency on plants on a more wide-scale basis. And it was first observed in corn and soybeans back in about 2014, 2015. And it's definitely something that gardeners, native planters, farmers, anyone growing needs to be aware of or know the symptoms of deficiency so they can kind of treat that. Okay, so there's this corner of the Climate Prediction Center website. It's like an underground basement, right, where all this great data is shown that never sees the light of day. So I wanted to show it. And if we look into the summertime, what we have in store for us is June, July, and August of 21. Most of the nation is predicted to experience a little bit warmer than normal temperatures. And you look at the numbers on there, and it's not a significant amount warmer than normal, but we're set up to be a little bit warmer this summer. And if we think about our friends in North Dakota and the drought that they're going through, the precipitation map is ugly, ugly, ugly. Predicted to have less than normal precipitation, and it only looks like 6 to 8 tenths of an inch, maybe less, but less than normal precipitation is not great. In the state of Indiana, did I add this in the slide? No. Yeah, okay, I did. So that map, when we look at El Nino Southern Oscillation and the various ways that it influences our weather, doesn't look like it's playing a large role in the forecast. We're in a La Nina right now. We're expected to maybe go INSO neutral later on in the year before heading back to La Nina to end the year. So that isn't showing up on the map very much. But it's important to note that for us, even though this map says that we have a pretty good chance of normal precipitation, there's only 3 ways that we get precipitation in Indiana. We can get a good hurricane to come up out of the Gulf Coast and slide far enough north to give us all a little precipitation. We can get a mesoscale convective complex, which is a pop-up summertime thunderstorm that can give us precipitation, or we can have a low pressure system come in off the Pacific, rise up over the Rockies into Canada, and then swing back down and give us a nice cold front, or even the associated warm front that would come with a low pressure system and give us precipitation that way. If we have drought set up to our west, the chances of one of those low pressure systems with the associated fronts coming through and being able to give us that precipitation is a little less likely. So we've got to rely more on those convective thunderstorms or the tropical storm activity in the Gulf. So that's a concern to keep an eye on. All right, to the models now, the future of central Indiana. This is the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, and they have now released data for every county in the state of Indiana, which is excellent. And this is for Marion County. In the past, if we want to look at days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, about 20 days per year averaged over the 1915 to 2013 time period. Predicted by 2040 to 2070, that 30-year average to be 61 to 74. And the difference between 61 and 74 is whether we look at a medium or high emission of carbon scenario into the atmosphere. So that's a tripling of the number of heat stress days. Hottest day of the year, 96 degrees generally for the past average. Depending on your scenario, it's 103 or 105 for the 2040 to 2070 time frame. And then if you look at the 2070 to 2100 time frame, it goes 105 to 111. So that's not encouraging. The warmer night temperatures, those that really concern people that grow things because respiration versus photosynthesis. Annual number of days when low temperatures stay above 68 degrees, 22 in the past, and we see almost a tripling again of that. So that's a concern. Plant hardiness zones, it's in the climate change impact assessment data, so who am I to argue with it? We've got 6B to 7A coming in by the 2040 to 2070 timeframe, and then a firm 7A for the 2070 to 2100 timeframe. And that's a change from kind of the 5B to 6A right now. So you would expect that coolest temperature in the winter to start to head towards being above zero by the end of that time frame. And if we look at what 7A looks like, so if we get to 7A in central Indiana, basically that's the type of plant hardiness zone for Tennessee. And if you look at the kinds of plants that can overwinter in Tennessee versus overwinter in Indianapolis, a little bit different, might be planting a little different things. Frost-free season is increasing. We've discussed that already, 27 to 32 days by mid-century. And that's where we're getting those extra growing degree days. Are we going to get rain or snow in the wintertime is something they put together. And the fraction of November to March precipitation falling as snow, 20 to 23%. So that's your chance of a white Christmas maybe. And we get down to 7 to 13%. So we cut it in half by the 2040 to 2070 time frame. Number of days with snow on the ground. And this is for South Central Indiana. I didn't update this slide. It's pretty similar to Central Indiana to South Central Indiana. Generally speaking, those numbers count for both. More water entering our rivers in the 2050s. So change of 7 to 8%. But that change is majority winter and spring when we don't have plants actively growing. And then we reduce in central Indiana summer and fall runoff by anywhere from 11 to 20% when we do have things growing, which means we get a little bit droughtier in the summer and fall. We get floodier in the winter and spring. Change in subsurface tile drain flow for spring increases quite a bit. And that's kind of where I'm going to cut it for climate parameters specifically. So some of those apply directly to agriculture and native plants, and some of those not as much, but it's that's the whole snapshot for central Indiana. So knowing what we know then, that we've got changes to experience, I put agricultural cliches as the hot title of that slide. And I know cliche has a negative connotation, but please don't take it as such. Cliches are cliches because oftentimes they're true. When I was growing up in agriculture, dairy farm, grain farm, stewardship and being stewards of the land was the number one most touted term for agriculture. And stewardship is maintaining that land through the generations, right? So the goal was to have productive agricultural land for the next generation. Then as I got into college, sustainability kind of overtook stewardship as the main phrase. And sustainability talks about more than just stewardship. It talks about sustaining all kinds of things, sustaining the soil, sustaining productivity, sustaining yields, economics. There's a lot of different ways to take sustainability. And I feel like at some point in time, I heard a lecture on every different possible way that you could talk about sustainability. Then as I got out of college, about 2 years into being an extension educator, so let's say a little over a decade ago, soil health started to overtake sustainability in the way that it was spoken of. And soil health, we know we have 4 tenets of soil health, and I'm not going to list those, but the basic idea of soil health is that we have looked at chemical composition of soils for a very long time. We can send soil tests into a lab. We can get the results back. We can change our fertility practices based on those results. But soil health includes the biological aspects of soil. And soil health, 4 tenets. But the one thing I always looked at is, okay, now we're starting to look at ways that we can increase the amount of carbon that we're storing in our soil as organic matter. And regenerative agriculture, then, this is going to be the new buzzword for the next decade, is taking that one step further and saying, yes, we want chemical and biological processes to be healthy in our soil, but we also want to regenerate soil carbon to regenerate clean waters, to regenerate our soils to a new level. And the practices associated with it also go above and beyond those tenets of solely soil health. So regenerative agriculture being a relatively new term, at least in popular nomenclature, and Brooke can slap me for this, but I did take the definition off of Wikipedia just to have something to go off of. And there are tons of different definitions out there. But if you look at the definition, it basically says it's conservation, it's rehabilitation of food and farming systems. It focuses first on topsoil regeneration. So that would be not only increasing organic matter, but increasing topsoil in general. And really, that's probably going to be a majority organic matter conversation. Biodiversity, so diversity of our agricultural enterprises, improving the water cycle, which kind of goes with regenerating topsoil and that kind of thing. Enhancing ecosystem services, supporting biosequestration. You can sequester carbon, and increasing resilience to climate change, strengthening the health and vitality of farm soil. So it is a relatively soil-based set of practices. And if you look at the specific practices that are involved with regenerative ag, small scale farming operations, generally speaking, how do we recycle the waste on the farm? Are we composting everything that we can? Are we setting aside non-productive land for pollinators or other uses? And then on larger scales, we're really looking at the diversity of the crop rotation. So definitely getting out of a corn soy rotation and looking at the type of diversity that involves 4 or 6 different practices on a single field over the course of time. It incorporates soil health and all of those principles that we've learned about with soil health. It involves strategic use of conservation reserve program. So the thing about large scale agriculture is that setting aside an entire field and not using that for anything that will make you money doesn't line up with economic fundamentals. I teach Intro to Agribusiness for Vincennes University, and we just covered that last week. If your land is not in production of anything that will bring you cash, it violates fundamental economic principles, not just agricultural economic, pure economic. So the Conservation Reserve Program is a Farm Service Agency program that will enroll your acres and you set them aside and let them grow up. You have to do a few management practices to keep it from becoming forest. But and in return, you receive dollars from the government for doing that. So on the large scale, if you're going to set land completely aside and not plan to get any cash off of that, that's where the CRP program comes into play. And then there's been a little bit of a larger push in mainly academic circles, but it's starting to spill over a little bit lately for agroforestry, which is incorporating trees, particularly trees that would produce something that you could sell into some acres alongside or maybe with your cash crop. So a little bit on crop rotation. Traditionally, continuous corn and soybean. In the southern part of central Indiana, far southern part of central Indiana, you can start double cropping wheat into soybean. And as you look across the state, that's our traditional crop rotation on most acres. If you look at regenerative type of rotations, and don't take these as the right type of rotation, this is just some examples that happened to pop into my brain this morning. You could go a soybean, corn, throw cover crop in the mix for some winter time, make it into beef pasture for a year or two, then sell some tomatoes to red gold, then go back to soybean. You could and this is actually this is close to what the University of Wisconsin, in one of their long-term ag research trials, found to be potentially the most economic for that region. 2 years of alfalfa, a year of corn, or maybe 2 years of corn, and then a year of soybean. And then I put fallow in there. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but that 5-year rotation in Wisconsin, where you have a lot of dairy cattle and can use the alfalfa, had the best returns for a larger set of rotations. Generally speaking, when we do have these long rotations, we are focused on building up that soil carbon. Here's where I talk about the term fallow. There's been some talk of taking some acres, a field or two, and in that rotation, just letting it sit out a year. And we're actively managing it during this year. We're planting something into it so that we don't get our weed seed bank built up. But that we plant that year is not intended to produce any kind of cash crop. And it may be incorporated into the soil the following year, or it may be just mowed or cut and left on the soil surface. So there has been some talk and a couple of farmers that are professing to be able to manage their rotations to a high enough degree that they can completely eliminate synthetic fertilizer use. And those that are doing this are also looking hard at those organic certification acres. But you can do that by allowing nitrogen to be supplied by animal manures when you add those into the crop rotation, and legumes like soybeans. Certainly manure has a high phosphorus content and potassium. Well, high phosphorus content, not so much on the potassium, but through organic matter cycling, you can get a little bit more of those nutrients. And then this particular idea of fallow is when native plants, if we can convince farmers that that fallow period should include native plants, we can start really breaking through into the amount of acres that are in that kind of system. So I know everything is relatively brief, particularly the intersection for native plants, but this is my summary. What we've seen from the past and what we're seeing into the future is that the climate's definitely changing. More flooding in the spring, more droughts in the summer, slightly longer growing season. We're getting warmer summer nights. Regenerative agriculture is the next step forward in the chain to get us to the time when our soil organic carbon and organic matter are rebuilt to levels that allow us to look at our nutrients and look at farming in a different light. And then as we look at the ways to increase native plantings within regenerative agriculture, fallow periods is one. What we decide to put into that CRP program and how we use that could be another. And then there may be some opportunities when we look at cover crop selection. And cover crop would be traditionally the crop that is planted in the fall, just to have something green growing into the spring, and then it is terminated either by herbicides or mechanically as we get the next cash crop put in. Maybe some cover crops will pop up that may be native plants as well. So that's the presentation. I wanted to make it relatively brief to leave plenty of time for questions should they arise. And I will stop sharing here in about 10 seconds, just in case anyone wants to get my contact information.
Thank you, Hans. I like your final image as well.
Thanks.
Okay, if folks have questions, thank you, Jackie. Yes, Hans, that was fabulous. Thank you. All kinds of information. folks, feel free to enter your questions into the chat. One question I had is, why not let CRP land go to forest?
Generally speaking, because that land is going to come out of CRP at some point. And when it does, the amount of time and material and cost that it would take to get rather large trees at the 30 years at that point,
Right.
get those taken out would be kind of a juggling match as to whether you should actually return it to ag land or not.
Okay. And also, so when you talk about these fallow periods, are those also opportunities for cover crops?
Yeah, so the fallow period would be generally the same as a cover crop, except you would extend that cover crop throughout an entire growing season.
Okay. Okay, so what native plants do you think could be planted if it is just for a year in fallow grounds?
Okay, I'm going to admit I'm no expert in what's native and what's not. You all are the experts in that. So that's my challenge, is do a little research and see what you think could go into something like that. I do know that we've had good success working with the Fish and Wildlife Service in when I was in Gibson County with restoring some farm ground into a native prairie grass and forb situation. And it did not take more than, well, we got good growth the first year, really. And that was not great soil. So I would expect, if you consider that most of Indiana was deciduous forest from way back in the day, but we do have some prairie soils out in the western end. Some of those grasses and forbs to be native, that could be something that could be used with success.
Yeah, and I've been curious about how many native annuals we have here in Indiana. That's something that actually I'm not familiar with, so that's some homework that I can take on. Okay, somebody asks, what does CRP stand for again?
Conservation Reserve Program.
Okay, and that's where you're putting part of your farmable land into conservation. And did you say that's for a 30-year commitment?
Some contracts are for 10 years, some contracts are for 30 years. It is a national program, and they have enrollment periods, and they'll shut those down at certain times based on whether the government believes that we are overproducing or underproducing nationally.
Okay. Next question. We have a, oh, so Claire Lyons, who is a Hort student, asked, would the land go to agroforestry instead? I'm guessing that that's in relation to my earlier question of why not let it go to forest.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the if it could go to agroforestry, then you would be planting your specific planned cash crop of trees, pecans, hazelnuts, fruits, that type of thing. And you would be managing those trees. And generally speaking, as a rule, the CRP program doesn't like you to be that actively managing. So if you picked agroforestry, you wouldn't necessarily be eligible for CRP.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. One question Ingrid asks, when should we start planting for the Tennessee climate zone?
I wouldn't go there just yet. As much as I have little faith in the plant hardiness zones, we do get the occasional wintertime temperature that is going to knock out some zone 7 plants in central Indiana, and down my way, not as much. So I would maybe get you a list started and hold off for a few years before you delve too deep into the Tennessee natives. But certainly by the 2040 to 2070 timeframe, we'll need to be ready to have some plantings of those.
Our nurseries will have to be thinking about that. Okay, Alicia asks, is CRP national? Yes, Alicia, that is a national program. Grant asks, should we be selecting Tennessee natives for our Indiana future native planting plans yet? I think that relates to the former question, right?
Yeah, it does, but there are some natives that are native to both Indiana and Tennessee, and certainly that overlap can be looked at.
That would be valuable. Sarah asks, if the number of electric cars is likely to increase in the future, the need for corn to produce ethanol will significantly decrease. Are farmers worried about this and thinking to plant more diverse crops?
So the ethanol question is a good question, and I don't know that we are, as an agricultural community, really thinking about that future on the farm level. I do think that there is enough of a push to get ethanol products into different uses that the demand for ethanol will not go away completely. I think there was a last part to that question that I didn't cover. Oh, and thinking to plant more diverse crops. There's two kind of ways to look at how the ag community is thinking the future plays out. There's one segment of the agricultural community that thinks, as ag land is so valuable and continues to be so valuable, that further specialization will occur and that large corporations and companies will start getting into ag land purchases and contracting with larger and larger farmers to farm that land until we get to, what mega farms. The other way to look at agriculture is kind of that diversity aspect, where farmers are going to break down the specialization a little bit, increase the diversity of the rotations, go back to a little bit more of that master of all trades kind of production, but it's going to take a special kind of farmer to do that. So
it's normally the smaller farmers that do that. Is that correct?
It has been traditionally, but you're starting to see some larger farmers, particularly in central Indiana and north central Indiana, that are taking regenerative ag very seriously on the order of 5,000 to 7,000 acres per farm. So, yeah.
Okay, that's good news. Do you expect pollinators to be decreasing as climate change occurs over time?
No, I don't, and basically because climate change, well, it's not the biggest factor in pollinator levels. I think human activity is the biggest factor in pollinator increases or declines. Direct human activity, I mean, climate change is human activity, right? It's just a little bit more indirect. So I would expect that our actions to protect pollinators can have a great effect on keeping those levels viable, even in the face of climate change, if we take an active approach.
Thank you. P and K can come through. I'm sorry, P and K can come too from the bacteria and the fungi in the soil food web with plant roots, right?
Yeah, I mean, existing levels of P and K in soils, bacteria, fungi, the biological properties, those all cycle in the soil. And so availability of P and K can change, increase or decrease based on the biological activity of soil. So yeah. Before we take another question, I had a private question that I really wanted to get to.
Yeah.
Marty was asking, what do you think about the carbon markets in USDA under Vilsack and Biden? And I didn't directly address that, but if we're practicing regenerative agriculture and working diligently to increase the amount of carbon in our soil, we ought to get paid for that. And that's where these carbon markets come into play. I think they're an excellent opportunity to incentivize good practices. I don't know whether we end up with a private market with public backing, or a public market. And that's why I'm a little hesitant right now to be talking with Indigo Ag or True Terra or some of these that are offering the carbon markets, because we'll have to see what kind of government, whether a carbon bank gets created and other things like that before I start enrolling acres.
All right, good comment, thank you. David asks, looking at your climate maps, I noticed what looked like very large increase in rainfall along the coastal regions versus what Indiana is seeing. Is this correct? And if so, how do you think that might impact the growing season?
So let me, as far as that goes, let me get back into the slides and kind of see where that map pulls up, because I'm so Indiana centric that I haven't. Yep. Increase in rainfall. I don't believe that I'm seeing the same. Oh, you're talking about the summer outlook here. So you notice on the East Coast in particular, we've got a very above average prediction. I assume that's the right slide. And in that case, we're just talking about this summer, and we've got indications that we may see a little bit more active tropical storm and hurricane season this year. And that's what that is referring to. The likelihood of more precipitation on the East Coast results from that particular effect.
Sorry, my dog was barking. Corbin asks, what types of cover crop mixes have you seen or would you like to see on commercial operations? We dairy and have had great luck with a wheat rye mix, which we are able to use as a spring forage crop before corn. Have you seen other mixes used successfully as a forage crop?
So I've seen all types of different cover crop mixes, to tell you the truth. And the wheat rye mix is a good mix. As far as other mixes used successfully as forage crops, sadly, my neck of the woods doesn't have near the dairy or near the beef head that it used to. So I haven't seen a lot of cover crop mixes used as forage crops. Need to get out to New York or other people's ways to take a look at that. But I would recommend that if you're thinking about a mix, the Midwest Cover Crop Council has an excellent cover crop selector tool that is based on your particular area, and it does cover the entire Midwest. It gives you a good idea of what will grow, when to plant it, when to terminate it, and it was updated last year. So that's the Midwest Cover Crop Council's cover crop selector tool.
Great, thank you, Hans. So Sarah asks, do you know what percentage of farmers in Indiana are practicing regenerative farming now? And is there a growing interest in this idea?
Truly regenerative farming with every practice covered, I could probably tell you the amount of people on a single hand in Indiana as far as large scale producers go. Now, when you look at smaller scale producers, there are a lot that are getting into as many practices as they can. So that's very heartening to see. As far as a percentage goes, there's no data on that, and it would be really subjective data if we could get data on that. So I can't throw out any percentage there.
Hans, with that said, do you suspect at some point there's going to be some kind of a certification process like there is with organic farming? Especially if there's credits involved.
Yeah. I don't know that there will be a single certification for regenerative agriculture, but the regenerative agricultural principles align well with the organic certification to begin with. So you may see like a farm that decides they're going to certify organic, and they're also going to certify in the carbon markets, and that's kind of their regenerative ag play. We could see a certification, but it will likely, if at all, be a private endeavor for the companies that you're selling your crops to, if it pops up.
Okay, fair enough. Carolyn asks, aside from using native plants in our yards, how can homeowners help with climate change in our small spaces?
Oh, great question. Great question. So in small spaces, helping out with climate change, it's the little things to start out with. You know, did you drive a little bit less the next time you go to purchase the vehicle? Is it going to be a little bit more gas efficient? You know, you don't have to go straight to EVs, but
can you
am I
EV real quick?
Oh, you don't have to go straight to electric vehicles. Better fuel efficiency helps. Am I reusing things that I can reuse? Was my trash bag really wet, or you know, otherwise needed to be emptied? Persuade. Look at the principles of persuasion and see if you can persuade a neighbor or two to adopt a carbon friendly practice. And then when you look at the legislative body, are you actively engaged with your legislators and letting them know your feelings on not only the carbon bank? We've got a dozen or more bills related to climate change in one way, shape, or form in state houses and up at the federal level right now. So be actively engaged that way.
Mm-hmm. I would add one more thing to that list. It's a small thing, but significant. Is think about reducing your food waste. Think about that in terms of grocery shopping, what you bring home, the size of meals that you cook. And for those pieces, you know, carrot, vegetable ends, that sort of thing that you aren't going to use, think about composting and preventing those additional trips to landfills and methane just from food waste. It's incredible that we waste 40% of our food in this nation.
That's a great point. If you look at agriculture's responsibility for climate change, the statistics are generally anywhere from 14 to 17%. But if you include transportation of food, retail of food, consumption of food, that number goes up to nearly 50%.
Yeah, great, thank you. So we have several more questions. We're getting close to the hour, but I'd like, if Hans, if you don't mind sticking around to get through these questions. Do you mind? Okay, great.
No, not at all.
We'll keep going then. In Indiana, does regenerative agriculture also cover having more diversity of swards for cattle, sheep, and grazing animals, etc.?
Diversity of swards. I'm not familiar with that word.
I was hoping you would be. Because I'm not either. Let's see. That was Claire Lyons. Claire, can you unmute and maybe further define that question?
Yeah, sorry. I'm from the Republic of Ireland, so maybe you guys, it's a term I hear Christine Jones and Elaine Ingham and people like that use a lot. It's basically the stuff that the cows or ruminants or grazing animals would graze on. So instead of just having one species of grass that we again, I don't know in Indiana, sorry, but you know, generally the cows are just eating one type of thing all the time, like it could be ryegrass in this part of the world. So now in regenerative agriculture, this talks of having a much greater diversity of what the animals can eat on, including also bringing back more trees and other types of vegetation instead of just having them eating herbal leaves all the time. So
Sure.
there's much more diversity in what they graze. Like, you know, cows in the past would have lived in partial woodland settings, and we've just, you know, we give them these open grass paddocks. It's also, you know, I suppose bringing back in trees into the system, so there's shelter for animals or shelter belts and things like that. So that's, again, I don't know if this is suitable for Indiana. I don't know enough. Sorry about your climate. Sorry, I'm in the Republic of Ireland, by the way, as it goes. It's 1 o'clock in the morning here too, so I'm a bit sleepy, so sorry. Anyway, thanks for a great talk. I can put some links in the chat too if people don't know Christine Johns or Elaine Ingham or people like that, or Gabe Brown. People like, there's there was a really good conference on in England, the Oxford Real Farming Conference. That was something else that's really good to check out. Anyway, sorry, thanks. I've been just chucking questions in the chat. So,
sure.
thanks.
So to answer your question specifically, the diversity of swards is not currently. So after we get through with regenerative agriculture, there's going to be a next level, right? And there'll be a level where we get to that kind of thing. But as we look at regenerative agriculture and increasing diversity of rotation, it's still just adding cattle or sheep or grazing animals back into the equation, right? We're still trying to break the traditional agricultural cycle of corn beans in Indiana. So the diversity of that grazing is probably going to be another step or two down the line.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hans. And Claire, thank you for the clarification and for joining us at such an odd time for you.
Great, thanks for having this on.
Claire also asked, does the CRP allow for hedgerows or edge habitats instead of barbed wire, etc. fencing?
Yes, absolutely. There's no fencing requirement on CRP. Okay.
Alicia says, I think we are far enough out from electric still for ethanol to be a concern, but certainly with the change in diet, going away from meat-based diets and feed, crop corn will go down. And I would think in regards to Sarah's question, but I don't see either being significant enough to overcome government subsidies. So until government subsidies go down for convincing them to grow the crops that aren't as needed in the future, they have a better investment going with guaranteed money, I would think. Do you agree? Did you catch that?
That do you agree is not part of that.
I was trying to get a question out of it. It's not really a question. Do you want to just leave it at a comment then?
Leave it at a comment if you don't mind.
We can do that. What do you think of the new ag carbon markets?
So Marty, you asked that question privately earlier, and that I covered it. I think I like them. I'm not bought into them personally yet, but I plan to as soon as I know a little bit more about how it's going to go.
Great. Indiana can only plant corn and soybeans. What other farm products can plant in Indiana? Sanoke asks.
Okay, so Indiana plants a lot of corn and soybeans because we can efficiently produce and ship a lot of corn and soybeans. We have 3 ports in the state, one at Mount Vernon, one at Jeffersonville, one at Burns Harbor, and we can get a lot of corn and soybeans out into the world market through those ports. We can produce any mid-latitude crop in Indiana. We have really great soil. We do have a red gold plant in Indiana, so we plant a lot of tomatoes. We do have some sandy soils in the Southwest and some good growing in Jackson County to be able to be a player in the watermelon and not as much the muskmelon anymore since we had a little bit of a food disease outbreak, but certainly still have some acres of that. We have excellent mint production up around Chicago and used to feed Wrigley's gum a lot of spearmint and such. So we can produce a lot of different things. But our vast majority of acres are corn and soybean at the moment.
Okay. So Claire has some more questions for you. What regenerative agriculture practitioners can you recommend? Gabe Brown is one person. Can you give other people to look up for ideas?
So as you look at people in Indiana that are to the point where they're beyond soil health and into regenerative ag, Rick Clark is one person who would be at that level. there's about 4 or 5. And he's the first one that comes to mind because before COVID, he was the last one I heard speak in person. I'd have to get with Lisa Holscher at the Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative to throw out more names. But yeah, there's a few, and Rick Clark's a good one to start with.
Okay, great. And Claire, hopefully you got Hans's contact information and you can follow up with him later. She also asks, what do you make of Bill Gates buying up land and entering into farming?
So in the dichotomy of the way the future of agriculture is, that kind of sides with the maybe big companies and corporations are gonna, buy up a lot of land and start specializing. But I also understand that Bill Gates is a man of philanthropy, and he could have philanthropic ideals. I don't make much of it at the moment, other than it is a strategic decision from a person who's made a lot of money making strategic decisions. So,
Hans, real quick related to that, I was in a webinar yesterday talking about diversity in the food system and equity in the food system. And I heard that some farms are deeding their land to indigenous groups in the future. Have you heard anything about that and how prevalent that might be?
I have not personally, no. I've got to declare ignorance there.
Okay, yeah, it was new to me. So, okay, let's move on. Claire says, I've listened to lots of Christine Jones and Elaine Ingham. Would you have other people resources to be reading, watching, and looking up? Is that what we just hit on?
A little bit. Yeah. Definitely if so the SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education, is going to start producing a lot of resources related to this. So check them out. In Indiana, the Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative is on top of regenerative agriculture. They just haven't used the term as much yet. They will. So those two entities, I would be looking for resources pretty soon here.
Okay, fair enough. She also asked, how do you recommend terminating cover crops? Can they be rolled and then planted into, or how are they particularly terminated?
Okay. So the most common way of terminating is via herbicide, little bit, a couple weeks or so before planting. They can be rolled and then planted into, and that's something that is a step beyond, step towards regenerative. They can be crimped and planted into, and between rolling, crimping, and spraying, those are pretty much the most common ways in Indiana that we're terminating.
Hans, do you think we're going to see better crimping technology come out that could increase those practices so that we can lower the herbicide use?
I think we will, but I think particularly as we look at increasing technology on this side, it's going to be government dollars that fund a lot of that. We won't see a whole lot of R&D on the private side in the near term.
Okay. Claire also asks, is plowing typically avoided, especially deeper plowing?
If we're looking at soil health, regenerative agriculture, no-till is the way to go. We're not plowing at all if we can help it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kayla asked, do you have any thoughts on the Savory Institute?
None whatsoever. Never heard of it. Gonna look it up as soon as this is over.
Okay, Claire was wondering the same thing. Or Claire asked the Rodale Institute or the JANA experiment.
Familiar with the Rodale Institute, like what they're doing. JANA experiment, also unfamiliar at the moment.
Okay. Claire also notes to at Carolyn, if you can compost, if you can source food from more local sources as much as you can, it's hard. And then cut down on plastics. Again, that's hard. And I think that was to the question, what else can a residential person do? And as well, grow insect-friendly lawns too. Claire, and plant some native plants if you can. some big thanks to you, Hans. Great presentation. Ingrid says to buy local from Indiana growers. For those of us in Indiana, lowering emission levels from transportation. Try the online market wagon, farmers markets, etc. Ingrid further says you should have at least 70% Indiana native plants in your yard in order to make a difference for biodiversity. I think there's been a number that came out fairly recently.
Interesting to note on the buy local. It would help with the carbon footprint. However, teach it Vincennes, the agribusiness class, and the book that I'm using specifically states that the buy local movement defies basic economic principles as well. If you look at basically the idea that the best producer of a product should produce that product and then ship it all over the world, I thought that was interesting. I still think you should buy local, but
yeah, there could probably be multiple facets to that conversation, right? Okay. Sarah asked, do you think hemp will become a crop to grow in Indiana?
Hemp is currently being grown in some locations, and it's one of those crops where you need an end market. And if we can get a good end market, a company that processes or otherwise uses that crop, then we'll have a nice sustainable practice for hemp in Indiana. If we don't find that market, then it's not gonna last.
Right. Okay. Okay. Claire has put a resource in the chat, and that's on the Bill Gates story. And that's SARE, S-A-R-E, standing for something.
Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education.
Thank you. Ingrid asks, can we grow northern black garbanzo beans in Indiana and lentils as good sources of protein?
On a small scale, yeah. On a large scale, we don't have the market.
Okay. Claire has put another link in the chat. Christine Jones talks about Jana.
It's J-E-N-A. Okay.
Well, here she said, oh, yeah, you're right. Okay, in the link. Sarah says people can get rid of invasive species on their properties and or make sure they don't buy invasive species. Yes, thank you. A lot more thanks for the great information. Kayla put in a link to a TED Talk on the Savoy Institute. It's the Savoy, not Savory.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'll still check it out though.
Yeah. Yeah. Claire says, for what it's worth, have very mixed feelings on Savoy or Savory. Can be a little one size fits all what works in Zimbabwe. They can be very reductionist about what is reductionist. Their holism can be very reductionist and sadly don't focus enough on soil biome. All right, fair enough. We have gotten through all of those questions, Hans. Kayla's she's sharing another link in the chat. I'll try to save the chat also and send some of this out with the link to the recording. We'll be sending a link to the recording out to all of the registrants. Oh, wow, so many of them didn't actually make it here tonight, but I think they know they'll be getting that recording. So we'll be getting that out. I'll try and get these links out with it. Yep, they keep coming in the chat, so we'll give that one last minute. Hans, thank you so very much. That was a wealth of information. You got people thinking and learning some new stuff. It was inspiring. Climate change is not inspiring, but what we can do to make a better environment and atmosphere is inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. These were excellent questions. Just truly enjoyed spending time here.
Thanks, Hans. And thank everybody else for joining us here tonight. We truly appreciate it. Have a good night and good luck in all of your endeavors. Good night, everybody. I'm gonna stop recording.
I just threw a few more links in the chat there. There's I don't know if people know about the